2 Wochen haben wir diese Veranstaltung angekündigt, ziemlich genau vor 2 Wochen. Und es war uns schon klar, ja, das wird ein bisschen Wellen schlagen. Aber das Ausmaß, wie es jetzt war, haben wir uns nicht träumen lassen. Die Hauptfrage, die uns immer wieder gestellt wurde, was sagt dieser oder jener dazu? Meine Damen und Herren, an der Stelle ganz unmissverständlich. Wir sind eine unabhängige Jugendorganisation und wir laden hier zu einer Bildungsveranstaltung ein. Und damit kommen wir unserem Auftrag nach. Nicht mehr und nicht weniger. Wir sind insbesondere keine Partei, deswegen dürfen wir auch leider keine begünstigten Spenden entgegennehmen, aber das soll Sie nicht hindern am Spenden übrigens. Vielen Dank dafür schon. Ne? Da wir keine Partei sind, treten wir nicht zu Wahlen an und wir führen keine Koalitionsgespräche. Das heute Abend ist auch kein Koalitionsgespräch. Der Mann, der heute Abend unser Ehrengast ist, ich will Sie jetzt wirklich nicht länger auf die Folter spannen, ist ein europapolitisches Schwergewicht. Seit 1999 sitzt er im Europäischen Parlament. Und man kann nicht behaupten, er habe das getan, nur um sich Freunde zu machen. Es werden im Europäischen Parlament mehrere Dutzend Sprachen gesprochen, aber seine versteht jeder, auch ohne Übersetzer. Seine Wortmeldungen sind berühmt und gefürchtet, insbesondere bei den hohen Repräsentanten der EU. Mit Herrn van Rompuy verbindet ihn eine besonders innige Freundschaft, denn er hat immerhin mal das Charisma eines feuchten Lappens. Auch der ewige Provinzbürgermeister aus Würselen, Martin Schulz, Freundschaft verbunden. Meine Damen und Herren, Nigel Farage hat das Euro-Debakel schon kommen sehen, als man hierzulande noch von einem Erfolgsmodell sprach. Er hat mit seiner UKIP nicht vor Hohn und Spott der Etablierten zurückgeschreckt und hat weitergemacht. Mittlerweile schickt sich UKIP an, eine der stärksten Parteien in Großbritannien zu werden. Die üblichen Vorwürfe, die auch wir hin und wieder hören, Provinzialität, Engstirnigkeit, Xenophobie, straft er Lügen. Er bezeichnet sich als Libertären, weil er die Freiheit liebt. Und er hat schon früh erkannt, dass es diese Freiheit mit dieser EU nicht geben wird. Er hat im Ausland gelebt, innereuropäisch, außereuropäisch, hat an einem internationalen Finanzplatz gearbeitet. Ja, er hat gearbeitet, auch das ist nicht selbstverständlich im Europäischen Parlament. Und, meine Damen und Herren, seine Frau ist eine Deutsche. Er weiß also, wie es ist, unter einem Dach zu leben, das von einer deutschen Frau beherrscht wird. Meine Damen und Herren, begrüßen Sie mit mir den Mann, für den das Wort Euroskeptiker erfunden wurde. Nigel Farage.
Warm reception. Normally when I address audiences of this size, it's in the chamber in Strasbourg. And whilst it's true, I do generate quite a lot of noise, it's very rarely applause. So thank you. I want to thank Young Alternative for inviting me to come and speak here in Cologne this evening. The last time I came to Germany, and I spoke in Berlin 3 years ago to a group of concerned Eurosceptics, people worried about what the Eurozone project was doing to this country and indeed to the rest of Europe. And I said I would not come back to speak in Germany until... No. I would not come back to speak in Germany until there was a properly established political movement in this country offering the electoral something of a veteran at this game, because my conversion to Euroscepticism happened back in 1990. October 1990, and the British Chancellor of the Exchequer joined sterling up to something called the exchange rate mechanism. It meant effectively we pegged sterling against the Deutschmark, and we did it at a time when Germany was doing relatively well and Britain was doing relatively badly. And I knew on that evening that this simply wouldn't work. Now the reason I knew that was because, unlike most people in Western politics these days, and we have a House of Commons full of them, they all go to the same school, they all go to the same Oxford College, they all study philosophy, which in itself is not a bad thing, but they then all go into Parliament as researchers and become MPs aged 27 or 28, and none of them has ever done a proper job, a proper day's work in their life. And by contrast, you know, I spent 20 years working in the commodities business in London, trading, buying and selling copper, aluminium, and doing business with German companies and doing business all over the world. And I knew that an economic and monetary union, stage 2, and of course the euro was stage 3, I knew that the British and German economies were different things, that our economy very much more service orientated, the German economy very much more manufacturing orientated, and that our economies operated at different times and stages of the economic cycle. And within 2 years, we had interest rates at exactly double what they should have been, an extra 1 million people unemployed in Britain, we had record house repossessions, record business bankruptcies in 1992, and I thought back then that the whole project of economic and monetary union, and behind that the whole political project of attempting to take all these different countries in Europe with their different languages, cultures, histories, wines, cheeses, I'm not so keen on the cheese, but anyway. And the attempt to take all of these different groups of people and to force them into a new European state without ever asking people whether that's what they wanted, I knew from that moment on that this European project was in the hands of very, very dangerous, fundamentally undemocratic people, and I've been an opponent, now a firm opponent, of this project for 20 years. Of course, in the early days, there were some who tried to characterise and paint me out to be anti-European. But that was never the truth at all. I love Europe, and we should all love Europe. It is the most amazing, diverse, and fascinating continent on the planet, of the earth. In fact, if you love the diversity that exists in Europe, then I hope, like me, you think that Star-Spangled Banner, which they have as a flag, the adoption of a very nice piece of music, from Beethoven, but to be turned into an anthem, and the appointment of that fella from Belgium as the president. I hope, like me, that you would agree that actually all of those things have got nothing to do with Europe at all. They have hijacked the word Europe and decided that they, in the Brussels institutions, are what Europe now is. That they, with their flag and their anthem, and their totally ridiculous president from Belgium, by the way, I think he owes me big time. You see, when this little fella turned up and gave what was without doubt one of the dullest speeches I've heard in my entire life, the level of knowledge of Herman Van Rompuy across the whole of Europe was 2%. And after I told him his fortune, it went up to 4%. So I've been a good PR man. Well, of course, I was written off, UKIP was written off, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, that somehow we were mad, bad, dangerous people, and we went through a period of time, and this will be familiar to all the new Eurosceptic group, some UKIP banners in the audience. Well done, fellas, I love it. And as every new country adopts a Eurosceptic party, as I'm delighted to say has now happened here in Germany, all of us face the same challenges. We face a media that would rather just blank us out, or a media that when they do cover us, you know, make life very difficult indeed for us. And actually, if you think about it, you know, when you challenge a status quo, whether it's in politics, or in science, or in business, all through the history of mankind, if you challenge an established, comfortable status quo, they will always throw terms of abuse at you. And the more abuse that gets thrown at the AfD between now and May the 25th by the established media in Germany, the better, because it means you're making progress. So I now sense that there is a new Eurosceptic wind that is blowing through Europe, and in particular through the north of Europe. And I think we should examine for a moment just exactly why this has happened. I don't think anybody in this room or elsewhere would disagree that post-1945 it clearly made sense for France and Germany to be friendlier with each other and to trade with each other. Because one of the best ways of stopping people going into conflict is if they do business with each other. And so the idea was sold to the original founding countries that there would be a common market. A market where we trade, a market where we cooperate, a market where there would not be barriers of tariffs or excessive bureaucratic difficulties in trading with each other. And it was a vision that my country, albeit later and slightly reluctantly, but it was a vision that my country went for too. And indeed, you know, both my parents, when we had the referendum in 1975, both my parents voted yes for Britain to be in a common trading market with our next door neighbours in Europe. Now all of that looked and sounded fine. The difficulty was that actually, right from the very start, right from the first writings of Jean Monnet on this project, though never ever declared to the citizens of France or Germany or the latter-day members such as ourselves, from the very start, what actually happened here was that trade and cooperation was used as a cover for what was designed to be from day one an attempt to build a new United States of Europe. That is what this project was about from day one, and they never, ever told us the truth about it. But it was actually rather worse than that. It was rather worse than that, because the method by which they chose to build this United States of Europe was a method that from day one, it deliberately excluded democracy from the process. Excluded it completely. Monnet's thinking was that democracy was damned inconvenient. That because of democracy, you have national elections. And once every 4 or 5 years, you can vote for a government that takes a completely different direction to the government of before. So in policy terms, a country can sort of tack all over the place. For the big thinkers like Monnet, this was an inconvenience that wasn't to be tolerated, because he was one of the great and the good, and he knew far better what was good for ordinary people than they did themselves. Well, it's true. And so they set up a form of government whereby the European Commission, which is the bureaucracy of the institution, the European Commission, the bureaucracy, within which there is not a single elected person and over whom there is no method of accountability, they were the body from day one, and they're still the body today, that have the sole right to propose legislation and the sole right to repeal legislation. And what that means for you as voters in Germany, or for us as voters in the UK, is that you cannot, at a general election, and you cannot, at a European election, vote for a government that will undo legislation that you see to be damaging and put in place something else. It has gone beyond the democratic fingertips of ordinary folk to actually determine their own destiny. It is the death of democracy, and I think that the one thing we should really learn from history is not that in Europe, if we have nation states, will they go to war with each other. I think the lesson from history is that if European nation states are democratic nation states, we will never go to war with each other. And that is the motto. You only have to think back exactly 100 years to realise why what we did with the Balkans was a disaster. You know, at Versailles and afterwards, the Treaty of Paris, we got together and we said, we can't have all these little independent Balkan states constantly rowing and fighting with each other, shooting an archduke and goodness knows what else. We can't have this. We can't tolerate this. What we're going to do is we're going to take all those different countries, we're going to give them one flag, one anthem, one currency, one president, one army, one police force, and we will call it Yugoslavia. And because we do that, there'll be peace in the Balkans forever, and just look what happened. And what we are doing now, is we are building a European political project that has all of those symbols, that now even has an active foreign policy. You know, you'll notice that the British, French and Italians got together to bomb Libya, to get rid of Gaddafi, and that now Libya is in a far worse state than it was before. You might have noticed, that in the Ukraine, that we have been telling the Ukrainians, and the British are more guilty of this than anybody, but the EU has been telling the Ukrainians for 10 years that they can join the European Union and they can join NATO too, offering a completely false set of hopes to those Catholic Western Ukrainians who were pushed to a state where they actually toppled their democratically elected leader. And if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he decides to bite back. I don't want to be part of a militarised political Europe with a foreign policy. Far from it being something that will be good for peace, I think it may well pose an enormous threat as it seeks to increase its size and its muscle. You know, Mr. Barroso, another one of my great mates over there. And it is a delicious Eurosceptic irony that for the last 5 years, I've had seat number 20 on the front row in Strasbourg, in the chamber, and just a couple of feet away, in seat number 21, is Mr. Barroso. It's wonderful, isn't it? But even Mr. Barroso said 3 years ago, what we are doing in the European Union is we are building the first ever non-imperial, non-military empire. They want to build an empire, folks. And what does history tell us? What does history tell us about organisations that want to expand and build empires? It ends badly. This is not a project. This is not a project for peace and reconciliation. It may have been sold to us as that to begin with. Actually, the truth of it is, and I see it in the European Parliament when they play that anthem. I see the Euro-federalists standing, absolutely ramrod straight to attention. What we are actually now facing, we're not the nationalists, those of us that want to live in nation states, those of us that want to live in democracy, those that want to be able to determine our future and our children's future. We're not the nationalists, they are the nationalists in their desperation. But they have made two fatal errors. They have made two disastrous, fatal errors. And the first is actually part of that whole imperial idea. It is enlargement. You see, when the European community was Germany and the Netherlands and France and us and Denmark, and we had the ability to trade freely, goods, capital and services could move around freely, and also people could move around freely. But that never posed a threat to us, because actually the living standards in those countries were roughly similar. The incomes were roughly similar. The education systems, roughly similar. The health systems, roughly similar. But when we let in 2004, and onwards since then, groups of countries that had frankly not fully recovered from the disaster of communism, what we did was to allow in very poor countries, and then even poorer countries too, still, with Romania and Bulgaria. And we said to these people, you can have total free movement within the European Union. Now, you haven't got to be Einstein to work out that if you say to people in poor countries, they can move to rich countries with better education for their kids, with better health systems, and with, in the case of Romania and Britain, a minimum wage that is 9 times the size, you haven't got to be very clever to work out that there would be a very big migratory wave. And I see what is happening in the United Kingdom, and bear in mind that we are probably the most liberal country in the whole of Europe when it comes to immigration. Now, we've had successive waves of immigration since 1945, much of it from our old Commonwealth countries, and we've really achieved, I think we had achieved in Britain, a degree of integration that I think was enviable in many other European countries. But the scale of what is now happening is that we now have 4,000 people a week. 4,000 people a week come from southern and eastern Europe and settle in our country. And the vast majority of them are very good young people that want to work hard. Well, that's great. But it's also the duty of a government to put the interests of its own people first. And what open-door mass immigration within the European Union has done to the United Kingdom, well, some argue that it's put up our gross domestic product. I question that. But even if it has put up our gross domestic product, there's more to life than a couple of pips on our gross domestic product. There is the cohesion of our societies and the opportunity for our young people to go out and get jobs in the workplace. That, I think, is very important. And so in the United Kingdom, and in Denmark, and in Sweden, and in Finland, and I see the debate beginning to in parts of Germany here as well, we're beginning to actually rebel against our politicians because of what they've done to ordinary working communities and families. It doesn't affect the rich. In fact, the opposite. For the rich, it's terrific because it means cheaper nannies, cheaper chauffeurs, cheaper gardeners. In fact, for the rich in Britain, we're back to Downton Abbey. You know, they've all got domestic staff, and that's lovely. But what it's meant for millions of ordinary working people is that their wages have gone down. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've had a doubling of youth unemployment. And making these arguments in the past has been very difficult, because anybody that ever dared, anywhere in Northern Europe, to touch on the immigration question was always liable to have a very nasty label thrown at him or her. But I don't believe that's the case. And I think there is now an overwhelming groundswell of opinion, particularly in Northern Europe, given what I think in Southern Europe may well get worse. There is now a demand that says, actually, not only do we want our nation state back, not only do we want our democracy back, we want control of our borders back so that we can decide, in terms of quantity and quality, who comes to live, work and settle in our country. The second truly enormous error that the European project has made is the one that you all know about. I say that because you're paying for it. It's called Economic and Monetary Union. And, you know, I worked in economics, I worked in markets, I worked in currencies, as I said earlier, for 20 years. The argument that there could be a single currency for Germany and the Benelux countries, and perhaps parts of Scandinavia, in economic terms, that argument worked. But what never worked was for the south of Europe to link in the same economic and monetary union with countries like Germany, Finland, and the Netherlands. It was inevitable that this disaster would come. And I have to say that whilst the Germans may be somewhat resentful, as are indeed the Dutch and the Finns, about the money you've had to pay so far to bail out those countries, I'm sorry to be the bearer of news, which is you ain't seen nothing yet. The situation in Spain, the situation in Italy, in Greece and in Portugal is desperate. Desperate. There are millions and millions of people being forced into the most astonishing poverty. And to think that it's happening in Europe in the 21st century just because their idiot politicians wanted to join a big project is, I think, a very sad. Those countries are now experiencing deflation. It is a terrible economic malaise, recovery from which can take a very long time. I think in terms of the migration that we've seen from Southern and Eastern Europe to Northern Europe, I sense it's only just beginning. With youth unemployment rates now nearing 60% in Spain and Greece, what would you do as a young person? And we shouldn't blame those people for wanting to better their lives. But ultimately, there is going to be a rebellion against the euro in those countries. Someone's going to come along and say, look, we've got to cut our losses, we've got to default on our debts, we've got to get our own currencies back, we've got to have a devaluation and an attempt to trade our way back to profitability. I can't tell you whether that's going to take 2 years. I can't tell you whether it's going to take 5 years. But I can tell you that the euro will not hold together. And the economic consequences of that for Germany are very serious indeed. The money that you've committed to the bailouts, the very complicated Target 2 system. But Germany faces a big crisis too when some of these countries finally have to go bust. And that is why it is so, so important that you now have a political party in Germany called the AfD that you can vote for. Because it has within it some very brilliant people, some economists, academics and business people, because Germany is going to need a political voice to work out how you as a country are going to navigate those choppy waters when this euro finally ends. And I want to say that I wish the party all the very best of luck. I have my fingers crossed for you in the general election. You didn't quite make it, and I was up at midnight thinking, come on. But on May the 25th, you are going to do it. And I'm not interested in all the media questions I've been asked, and some of you guys have been asked, oh, which group are you going to join in the European Parliament? Who are you going to get into bed with, as it were? And frankly, all of that's irrelevant, and none of it should worry any of your heads at this stage. Those of you who want to see an active voice in German politics that stands up for national democracy, that wants to turn the tide of this monstrous European bureaucracy, and will have the courage to chart the future course for Germany. Don't worry what happens after May the 25th. Just go out there and jolly well make sure you succeed on May the 25th. Thank you very much indeed.